Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to Conversations Over Coffee. I'm Steve Warnick, Reb Steve, one of the rabbis at Beth Tzedek Congregation, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And this morning, our guest for conversation, and maybe for coffee if you'd like, is, hold on for 1 second here. I just lost my place. Is Guila Benchimol, who is the director of the SRE network. Guila, hang on. There we go. Senior advisor on research and learning with the SRE network, and is one of the key advisors who guided its launch in early 2018. The SRE network came out of the larger Me Too movement as a response and voice for awareness, education, and new policies, standards, and culture in Jewish workplaces as it relates to issues of violence and sexual harassment. This is a very, very important conversation, obviously, and we're happy to be able to have it and to learn from you, Guila, as we do so. Let's start at the beginning. I never want to assume that people are necessarily aware of all the different resources that our community has. Why don't you start by telling us about SRE, its founding, and the work that it does?
Okay, sure. So first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in, and thank you to Beth Tzedek for prioritizing this important conversation. There's a lot of issues of the day, but this is an issue that is not new, although I would say that the Jewish spaces have paid renewed attention to it, prior to the pandemic, obviously, coming off of Me Too, or the iteration of Me Too that went viral in October 2017. And we know that issues around violence have risen, violence against women have risen during the pandemic. And so while SRE does not necessarily deal with domestic violence, it is one of the areas that we provide a grant to one of our grantees, the Shalom Bayit organization. This conversation around sexual harassment, sexual misconduct is constantly in the news, as well as gender equity and gender justice. And so I appreciate that you and Beth Tzedek have taken the time to invite me for conversation over water for me, not coffee. I did the coffee before. So SRE did come out of it was a response, the Jewish communities, or the American Jewish community's response to Me Too. But I will say that in 2017, in the spring of 2017, a survey, nothing to do with SRE, we didn't yet exist, was launched around asking Jewish professionals, including clergy members, board members, anybody that worked in a Jewish organization, around their experiences with sexual harassment. So this issue was already bubbling up, I would say, for the Jewish community or for Jewish professionals, but there wasn't this mobilization to actually address it or do something about it in this very real way. And then post Me Too, I began getting a lot of calls from American organizations to ask me to come in, to fly out there to speak about my work in the area of sexual violence, my academic work, my advocacy work in these areas. And from that, SRE was born. So I was invited to Washington in January 2018 to the Schusterman Foundation's offices, and I addressed a room of, again, Jewish professionals, Jewish board members, Jewish clergy folk, around my research on sexual violence, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, as well as many other speakers that were there that day to speak about discrimination and equity issues, because the Me Too movement did not just allow stories of sexual misconduct to bubble up, but it also allowed for stories around inequity and stories around discrimination. And oftentimes we'll get that question, well, what exactly are we talking about? And does this fit in the Me Too movement? However, the Me Too movement is not necessarily one thing, right? It has allowed for many types of conversation. And so the SRE movement was formed, SRE network was formed, which stands for Safety, Respect, and Equity. And it is a network of over 150 currently American Jewish organizations, although we invite Canadian organizations to learn about us by going to the website srenetwork.org and also become members of our network. And what does it mean to be a member? So Reb Steve, you alluded to this idea of policies and practices. So at our first ever gathering in June of 2018, so we were, live for several months. We released these standards for Jewish organizations and Jewish spaces to uphold. And they were based off of many different pieces of research that we did on what standards should look like for safe, respectful, and equitable Jewish workplaces. And also very much so off of the EEOC standards in the US. And so the four main buckets of these—
Let's not assume people know what EEOC is.
Sorry, I'll get you the exact, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So they had just done a large study on what safe workplaces should look like and could look like and don't look like. And so, part of our work was speaking with them and looking at their research. And so our standards for Jewish workplaces to be safe, respectful, and equitable, and I would call that the three-legged stool. Right? It's not just about safety, it's not just about respect, and it's not just about equity. It's about all three that we believe lead us to what we would call gender justice. And so the four main areas of our policies or of our standards would be: the first is leadership and accountability. If your leadership is not on board for this to be an area that you're going to address, if there's not a budget line in your organization to ensure that there is proper training, that there is proper resources to take in complaints, to do an investigation should that need be, to ensure that proper policies are actually put together by experts, then the rest of the folk in your workplace are not going to see this as a signal that this is something that we care about. So you have to start with leadership and accountability. The second area is on policies and procedures. So these include taking in complaints, reporting, responding to complaints, investigating, knowing when to do an internal investigation, when to do an external investigation, being able to delineate, what's an HR issue and what's something that might be, outside of the scope, and we need to consult those outside of our organization. So that would be the second area, policies and guidelines. The third, the reporting and processes are the third. The second one would be policies themselves. So what are your anti-discrimination policies? What are your anti-harassment policies? Do they go beyond just sex and gender to include other forms of harassment and other forms of discrimination? So ensuring that those are in place and that your all of your staff know about them. Are your volunteers bound by your policies? How do you communicate that? And then finally, education and training, having regular education and training, not when there's suddenly an issue or when suddenly there's something splashed across the Globe and Mail or the New York Times. And then it's like, oh, we have to start being careful about that. So that was what we released in year one in 2018. And we just released a revised copy of those standards in which we've expanded our scope of discrimination and harassment to go beyond gender and sex, which is what I just talked about. So we knew in year one that this was something that we wanted to do. And now that we've gotten 150 Jewish organizations to join the network, we're able to expand that as we have other conversations in the Jewish world about racial justice and other forms of justice, to incorporate that into the work that we're doing at the SRE network.
How do you have any sense of how pervasive issues of sexual violence, discrimination, harassment are within the Jewish workplace? What how that relates to whatever data we might have for the general workplace, and also I think it's probably important for people to hear what are the types of experiences people are having when these abuses occur.
Yes, so that's a really excellent question, and it's one of my big issues as a researcher and also an advocate in this area. I've always been trying to get the numbers, right? What is the data? Where is the data? What are the numbers? And unfortunately, and this is not just a Jewish thing, many religious groups don't collect those numbers because, it points to negative stories in the community and it might shed a negative light and you don't want to air dirty laundry. However, if we don't do that, then how are we going to clean our space, right? What do they say? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I can't tell you quantitatively the numbers, but I can tell you qualitatively, both anecdotally, whenever I travel and I'll give a talk about this issue, I can always say that there will be a line afterwards of people coming over to me in the audience, to talk to me about their own experiences, that what I spoke about was not a rarity to them. And unfortunately, they have their own stories. In addition, at SRE, myself and a colleague, Mary Huber, we conducted a study on this very question that you asked. What are the experiences? What are the types of things that people have gone through? And we interviewed individuals who have experienced sexual harassment and discrimination in Jewish workplaces. And we also looked at the responses to other people's surveys using the same question, right? What are the experiences? And so I would say that the experiences spanned a continuum of what we call the continuum of sexual violence. And so it was a spectrum, right? You had some things that some people would consider, low level, misogynistic comments, different kinds of sexist jokes, leering, things like that, all the way to rape and assault, committed in Jewish spaces. And so what I would say is that when I speak to survivors and victims of sexual violence, and I say this as a trigger warning to anyone who's listening, because I'm sure people listening either have experience with that or know people who've experienced with that. And if you're listening and you think, I've never heard of this happening in a Jewish space, or I don't know anybody, I assure you that you do know, you just don't realize that you know. And so I'm holding anybody who's listening stories and experience with the utmost care and respect. And I also recognize that this conversation is difficult to have in Jewish spaces, which is another reason why we might not have the numbers. People don't want to ask and people don't want to talk about it. But those who reported their experiences to us, would always minimize it. They would say, I'm sure other people have gone through worse, and so I can't complain. And that continued to be one of the refrains. In our study, all of the perpetrators that were spoken about were men, which is not the same thing as saying that all men are perpetrators. I want to make that very clear. And that's something that Julie Lalonde, a gender-based violence advocate and activist and educator in Ottawa, always says, and I quote her because I think that's important to note. And I will say that men have come over to me at some of these talks and said to me, post my conversation with the group, I too have my own experience, but I didn't feel that I should take up the space of the women speaking. So we need to make space for all people to have these kinds of conversations, which is what the SRE network is doing. It's about gender justice for all. In addition to addressing also issues of equity and issues of respect. So trying to do all three at the same time.
So I just want to take a moment while we're in the midst of this conversation to say that we're going to put the SRE website up on our Facebook page and our YouTube page, so if people want to find out more. And also, if you have questions for Guila or for me while we're going through this conversation, you can ask them in that space as well.
Thank you, Reb Steve. I just want to say, since you're going to be doing that, thank you. So for the folks listening, if you want to read the executive summary of our report, it will give you a good snapshot of what not just the experiences of survivors in Jewish spaces have said, but also what organizations can do better, how they can respond better, as well as what the difference is in the Jewish media conversation and the discourse and how we talk about it is versus what people say they are experiencing. And if you have questions about that disconnect, I would love, people to reach out afterwards. You can also find our policies, our standards online, and you can use those and apply them to your own organization. And for Canadians, I'm assuming are listening here, if they want to join the SRE network and say, why aren't we part of this, right? It's all Americans so far. Let's get on that. So you're welcome to join the network and
So that was the question I wanted to ask next, which is, how do you understand Canadians not yet joining the SRE network, and what does it mean to join the network?
Yeah, so Reb Steve, I don't live far from your shul, right? I don't live far from the synagogue, and yet one of the rabbis had reached out and said, I didn't even know that you exist, and I didn't even know that you were in Toronto, right? You're in our own backyard, and I'll travel to these conferences and I'll meet people from Toronto at these conferences, and they'll say, you live right near me. I can't believe that I had to fly all the way here to hear you speak over here. So, your question can actually be mapped onto the larger question of what has the Canadian response to Me Too been different, if at all, than the US. And there have been different reasonings given for that. A lot of Canadians will say we had our Me Too moment during the Jian Ghomeshi trial, who was the radio host and CBC, celebrity star that was accused of many of these same things and taken to court. And there was a whole hashtag, right? Been raped, never reported, that came out of that case. And there was a lot of media conversation. I don't know if the Jewish community spoke about it in the same way that they are speaking about Me Too, but what happened at that trial, while the women were publicly supported, right, they did not get justification in court. And I think that put a chill on some of the conversation in Canada, although there has been a ton of activism post the Jian Ghomeshi story. There's also a difficulty in speaking publicly, right? I'm not going to get into the whole, but you can look up, SLAPP lawsuits and things like that. There's a little bit of a more difficulty of speaking about your perpetrator in public in Canada, where some women are being now sued by those they've spoken out against. And so that puts a chill on even the public discourse. However, to answer your question about why, Canada didn't seem to respond in the same way, Canadians are small C conservative. We don't mobilize, I don't think, and especially the Jewish community. In my experience, after pre-pandemic traveling to the US for 2 years on a monthly basis to speak about this, it was a normal part of conversation. I can walk into any Jewish organization in the US and have this conversation about Me Too, and it won't be considered weird or why is she talking about this? It's natural. I think here there was a more hesitancy to speak about it. Is it something that really happens here? If we bring it up, what's going to happen? However, I commend the conversations that have happened here. Limud Toronto did a whole panel with myself and some other rabbis at the panel. Hillel Ontario did an event that was, across the denominations. They had a representative across the denominations, and the Reform community, I would say, did a wonderful, series post Me Too, using actually some of those who were investigating at the CBC as the speakers there. So the other thing is, this is made up of primarily American funders, Jewish American funders and Jewish American organizations. And so the first goal was to get the people there on board.
Right.
But I hope that having me here could be a resource for Canadians that want to learn more and say, yeah, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is already there for us. Let's do this.
What does it take to join the network?
So you need to review the standards with your board and ensure that your CEO, if you're the representative, that your CEO is on board with this. It will involve a conversation with SRE around where you are. And then there's an assessment form that remains between yourself and SRE to see where you currently are vis-a-vis the standards. But the idea of the network, it's a coalition of the willing. Wherever you are, you could have no policies, but you want to do well. We want to help you along if we can. You can already be, fulfilling all of the standards, but you want to know more. So we want to be able to help you wherever you can. And we want you to help us, meaning this is a mutual learning opportunity. It's where peers come together to say, how can we create a better Jewish community, a safer, more respectful, more equitable Jewish community and Jewish spaces?
What are some of the things that, to the extent that where are the places where Jewish institutions typically can do a better job?
So that's a really good question. I think, post Me Too, there was a lot of, no, we're going to do this and we're going to do right. And we're going to, of course, keep your complaints, confidential or whatever the line might be that a CEO might give. And some HR folk were coming over to me at my talks and saying, this is all wonderful, but I work to protect the organization. And so when somebody, and I also have to follow particular procedures. So if I have to look into something, I need to know who's making a complaint. I need to know who they are complaining about, right? So one of the things is that everybody has to get on the same page, right? An organization has to get on the same page about what they are legally bound by, how they can ensure that their HR operates in a way that allows them to do their job, but also doesn't sacrifice those coming forward. So what are the ways in which they need to go beyond some of the legal to consider the ethics, the morals? How do we actually ensure that our Jewish values are not just values, but they are what we practice, right? So we have a lot of things that we say about everyone being created in the image of God, or everybody's equal, all of those kinds of things. But how do you actually practice those things, turning them into actuality. And then I would say in terms of understanding how to respond to disclosures that are not just about ticking off the boxes to ensure I don't get sued, but with empathy, with true empathy, and with understanding how much it takes to come forward. Right. And again, it goes back to that silence that we were talking about before, right? That I said here, we might be a little more hesitant. It's just saying, like, let's have these difficult conversations. We might not always agree, but if we have the same goal of creating a better, healthier Jewish community, how are we going to get there together?
Let's talk a little bit more specifically. And we have a question from YouTube asking this. What are some of the steps Jewish communities can do to reduce the culture of sexual harassment and violence at the workplace?
So, I mean, a lot of the steps are not necessarily unique to the Jewish community, right? I do work also with other faith communities. I'm on the board of the Survivors Network for those abused by priests, right? So I want to ensure that this is a human issue. This is not a Jewish issue. But as a Jewish community, we can use our traditions and our Jewish values to respond in ways that are unique to us or that speak to each other. So what are things that we can do better? So first of all, I would say, a lot of people like working in the Jewish community or functioning in the Jewish community because we're like a family, right? We're like a family. But like any family, sometimes there are unhealthy things that we do, or there are unhealthy family dynamics. So it's to recognize what those are. And instead of saying, okay, let's just get rid of it all, right? So for example, when a school asked me to create policies there, they said to me, we don't want to be a no-touch school. If a 3-year-old falls and hurts their knee and is bleeding, we don't want the teacher to say, I can't pick you up. Help us to maintain our warm culture in a way that is safe. So it's having those kinds of conversations. So recognizing some unhealthy dynamics that might go on, what does our Jewish community look like, and why does it look that way? And are there things we need to change about the structure? So, for example, I come from the Orthodox Jewish community. What are things that might be more difficult there for me as a woman that I can point out to the men who are in charge in my community, right? And to have those conversations with them. Not just having the difficult conversations, but then acting on some of the decisions that come out of there. So who are the voices at the table, right? Is it the same old people, not old in age, but is it the same kinds of people that are always there?
They might be the same too, but
well, maybe.
But you're not referring to age.
I want to be ageist, exactly. But is it the same folk who have the access to power and have the access to money, or is it bringing in those that are most impacted by these issues, right? So if you're going to have a conversation about gender, are folks of all gender at the table, and are you listening to what they say, and not just passing them not just amplifying their voice, but are you passing them the microphone to giving them the chance to lead? These are some of the things. And I would say a big one is just to let go of the denial, right? Admit that this is uncomfortable, but that this happens here. And, if anybody needs proof, you just need to open the Forward, E-Jewish Philanthropy, JTA, the CJN, formerly, newly, the CJN, to see some of these stories. But they should not just be talked about when something is in the news. This is something that we have to constantly ensure that we create a healthy environment, just like you would take care of your physical health all of the time, right? This is something that we need to ensure.
You had mentioned earlier that there is a gap between the media reporting of stories and the lived experiences of victims. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So what we found was that the media reporting focused a lot on clergy misconduct, right? So if a rabbi did something wrong, a rabbi, made a breach. So there was, the stories very much focused on that. But we found that when we asked people what kind of person, harmed you, it was really a whole spectrum of people. There were donors, there were board members, there were clergy, there were clergy speaking about being harassed by those in the pews, right? So it was actually a much broader perspective of types of person that would act in these ways. but the media really focused a lot on clergy. That was one of the things that we found. We also found that the media gave a lot of weight to the activities, the positive activities of the person who perpetrated, of the person who caused harm. So they would write, this person did this. This is not to detract from their support for Israel or their donations for whatever. That is, something, in my field, it has to do with cognitive dissonance, right? How can this person who has done all of this good, how can I compute that they also did this thing? So then we override the story of the negative with the positive that they did. But for victims and survivors reading that, it sounds to them like, okay, I could put this aside because, they did all of this good. And so they are sacrificed on the altar of good deeds of this individual, as opposed to saying, how can we look towards the victim and survivor and understand the impact that this may have had on them? So that was another one of the disconnects. And in the SRE report, the research that we did, we list many of them and talk about, the different ways that the media can do some reporting. And I recently even consulted with some Jewish reporters that there are media guidelines for reporting on sexual harassment and misconduct that the mainstream media uses. And this is something that should be put in practice in our community as well. And the last thing I'll say is a reporter said to me, I sometimes wonder how I can address my feminist leanings with needing to report on this story. And so I said to them, those two do not have to be in conflict with each other. You can respond and you can report in a trauma-informed way.
I want to ask a question about rehabilitation and tshuva. So there was, I don't know if it's still active, but there was a conversation in the last couple of months about Dr. Stephen Cohen, who was accused of harassment, apologized, admitted to it, publicly said that he was going to a process of tshuva, and then conversation about colleagues working to bring him back in, and people that were victimized either by him specifically or by others, saying, well, hold on, wait a minute here. I'm asking the question not specifically because I don't know the specifics, but as an example, is there obviously depending upon the nature of the offense, but is there some element of tshuva rehabilitation that's possible within these spaces, and what might that look like?
So that's a really great question, and thanks for asking about it. So I'm going to be clear, I'm not going to respond to the specific case, but I appreciate the example, and it's a good example. So recently for SRE, I drafted steps towards accountability that we just actually discussed and had a conversation with different rabbis that sit on the ethics committees at the Rabbinical Assembly for the Reconstruction Movement and for the Reform movement. So conservative reform and Reconstructionist. And as an Orthodox woman, some may wonder where was the Orthodox. It's a conversation for another time. There is definitely space for tshuva. There is definitely space for return here. And I would say that there are different levels of teshuva. There are different levels of return and of repair. I believe, and I've been trained in both restorative and transformative justice. And I think they go a little bit beyond the steps of teshuva, or at least the way that we have imagined teshuva as a Jewish community. When we talk about teshuva, we often talk about it as between individuals. X harmed Y, and so this person has to do teshuva to that person, and it's up to them to accept or not accept, and hopefully they can repair it. And of course, as a community members, where we believe that each person is responsible for the other, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, we have a place to support that person who was harmed. We may have a place to encourage the person who harmed. But what does it mean when we say that someone does teshuva? And who are we to actually be the arbiters of that decision, right? So if I am a victim of somebody who harmed me, well, I can tell you if that person has done teshuva directly to me, but I can't tell you if they've done teshuva to the others that were harmed by their actions to me. And so when we say someone has done teshuva, they maybe did it to the easier people that they can apologize to, or they may have even done the teshuva to the person they directly harmed. But when we breach our social contract, especially when it comes to these issues around gender justice, when we breach gender justice, it doesn't just have an impact on two individuals, it ripples out. And as I said before, the Jewish community is a large family. And so we often, right, if I stand for an institution and I do something wrong, that's going to impact the institution, the people in the institution, the people outside of the institution that may be affiliated in some way. And so what are the steps I need to take to ensure that I'm doing teshuva in a full way? So there definitely is room for teshuva. The question is, who is it for? Right? And whose responsibility is it to ensure that it happens? And what is the victim and survivor's role in that teshuva? Do we consider them when we rush to say, this person has to come back to the community? And is coming back to the community the same as teshuva? I mean, my answer to you would be no. Teshuva is one thing. If that person returns to their previous role, I don't think that's a factor in the teshuva. I'm not saying they should never be able to, pray in our community or have any role that does good in this world at all. That's not what I'm saying. But should an educator who molested children, for example, ever become a teacher again? I don't think so, right? So they shouldn't be returned to their previous role. But there definitely is room for teshuva, and it should be about repairing the harm primarily to the person who you harmed, understanding that it will also repair you, but there are many others that have been impacted there. And so for me, it's the question also, where does the community fit in that teshuva? So if person X works for your institution or someone, let's talk about someone else's institution, and they say, okay, that person has to go and do the right thing. But where does the institution have to say about what happened? Did they know? Did they look away? Were there red flags? What did they do when the person came forward? Are there steps that they need to take to do teshuva as well? So for me, restorative and transformative justice is a more fulsome and wholesome and communal-based approach to this repair that I think is something we can really, but I think the Jewish community is ripe for this. I would love to see us have these kinds of conversations and ask these difficult questions in order to, we need to tell the difficult stories, but we also have to bring hope into the conversation. And for me, it's in this very question that you asked.
Wow. So Guila, to be continued.
Yes.
And I hope, and I will certainly be willing to play a role to convene different elements, at least of the GTA, in the year ahead. I think this is a very, very important conversation. I think that we are ripe to have it.
And the time is right. It's Chodesh Elul, right?
It's Chodesh Elul. It's the time. It's the time for Cheshbon Nefesh. That's right.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Again, the SRE network, you can find it on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Their website information is available there. As Guila suggested, read the executive summary and some of the policies. If you're interested in finding out more, contact them directly. Really, really important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Reb Steve, for this conversation. Chodesh Tov. Be well.
Chodesh Tov, everyone, and be sure to check out all the wonderful ways to be engaged in the meaningful Jewish life at Beth Tzedek, www.beth-tzedek.org. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.